Life and prosperity or death and destruction? Has there ever been an easier choice? It's the choice that Moses put before God's chosen people, the Israelites. Remember, as they're about to come into the promised land, he says, I put before you life and prosperity or death and destruction. Are you going to follow God's plan or are you going to follow your own? And so today I want to give you a financial plan that never fails. You might say, John, how can you do that? Well, let me tell you, as a CPA with a PhD in accounting, I have seen a lot of financial plans, and they all do the same thing. The financial plans will start out with saying, okay, work hard, or maybe have a great investment, stick with that, make sure you earn more than you spend, but have those hard work, great investments. It's going to lead to prosperity, and when you get enough money, you're going to finally have peace. Those are false promises. Money can't buy you peace. Let me explain how different that plan is from Jesus' plan. Jesus' plan starts where the other plans leave off. Jesus' plan says, let me start you with peace and prosperity. What do I mean with that? Well, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So even though you are desperately poor, in comparison to God, desperately poor, when we come to him in humility, he says, great news, the kingdom of heaven is yours. You actually have peace and prosperity already. You don't have to work to get it. I've given it to you. And with that, we have the freedom to do those things that God has called us to do, to live the life God has called us to live. And so we need to get rich right. By right, I mean a character component, righteous versus wicked, and I mean a competence component, correct versus incorrect. Both of those fit into God's idea of rightness and righteousness. So we need God's rightness. We need to understand, by the way, that his ways always work. God's ways always work. So along that line, I also want to mention one more thing. You may need a new definition of rich, a new definition of rich. If your definition of rich is to have more than your neighbor, well, there's some things God can't do. One of them is to make everybody above average. So, what new definition of rich? From more than your neighbor to more than enough. God promises us more than enough and abundance. Not only enough for yourself, but enough to share. And with this attitude, we are then set up for a whole new purpose. And this is a purpose I don't see any financial plans getting right. Here is Jesus' purpose for wealth. Jesus says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. And that, I would argue, is the purpose for wealth on earth. Okay? Use worldly wealth to gain friends forever. Let me explain how deep this really is. You've heard of the Great Commandments. What are they? To love God and to love people. Well, when we use our wealth to love other people as God has loved us, we fulfill the Great Commandments. Okay? Better yet, if we do it in such a way that it brings glory to God instead of to ourselves, guess what happens? They're attracted to God and they might become disciples. The Great Commission, right? So we can actually fulfill the Great Commandments and the Great Commission by simply handling worldly wealth well, by using it to gain friends forever, disciples. So let me explain how this works, a very simple 4-step plan that is spiritual and then also has a component that gets to this other part of righteousness, the correct versus incorrect part. And here we go. So 4-step plan, this is right out of the next couple of verses as Jesus explains how. He says that if a person is if they're trustworthy with a little bit, they'll be trustworthy with much. If they're deceitful with a little bit, they'll be deceitful with much. And then he goes on to say, if you can't even handle worldly wealth, who will give you true treasures? If you can't even manage someone else's money, who is going to give you money of your own to manage? And so I've broken this into 4 simple principles. The first one is about being worthy of trust. So how does someone become worthy of trust? I've got a diagram here for you that I call the right principle that gets at this idea of rightness. On the one axis, we see high versus low character. On the other axis, we see high versus low competence. And so if you put someone in this low character, low competence box, you would probably call them a fool. Certainly not someone you can trust. If you put someone in that far out box with both high character and high competence, you might say that is a righteous person instead of wicked, so high character, but is also a person that has high competence. They're good at getting the correct answer instead of the incorrect answer, and that person is wise. A lot of people come into APU, my students, and a lot of times I think they start in this other box that is high character but low competence. The Proverbs might call that person simple. They might call them naive or immature. Okay? So they have the character, they have a desire to do what God says, but they don't have the competence yet. And this last box, sometimes I run into people who are very good at being very bad. Okay? They can get the right answer, they know how to manage money, they can get a lot of it, okay? But they have low character, and that person's a menace to society. So with this idea, that's the first step, that you need to be trustworthy. You need to have both character and competence. I'm going to leave the character between you and God. Today I'm going to talk about a competency piece for you that I think will really help. So here's a competency piece. I'm going to call this the 2-minute accountant. Now, I spent 11 years getting my PhD in accounting and the undergraduate work, but in 2 minutes I'm going to give you all the counting that most people need to get started to increase their competence. Here it is. The first question is, what has God given you? If you can't answer that, how do you know if you're being accountable? How do you know if you're making the most of what God has given you? So what has God given you? And it's really easy to measure. Accountants call it a balance sheet, but here's all we're doing. We simply say, what do you own minus what do you owe? That is what we call your net worth. Okay, so things people own that might be big, maybe a house, maybe a car, clothing, maybe some investments. What do you owe? The 3 biggest things for most people is a mortgage, student loans, or credit card debt. But what you own minus what you owe is your net worth. This is what God has given you. Let me go on to the next question. What did you do with it? Okay, what did you do with it? Now, accountants call this an income statement, but we simply look at what did you earn versus what you spent, and that is going to be your profit or loss. Okay? Looking back, that's what you've done. Looking forward, we call it a budget. Okay, looking forward, we call it a budget. Why? Because the same thing, you are going to predict what you're going to earn this next year and what you're going to spend the next year. Okay? Your best prediction for a budget is what you did last year. Okay? So with those 2 things, that's all the accounting you really need, most people, to get the competency going to help you be trustworthy. Step number 2. Little to much. How do we go little to much? So one of the main ways that people usually think about is our labor. And in fact, if you look at the wisdom literature, particularly Proverbs, there is a wisdom-wealth connection where it says do something, do it right, and be generous. That's your labor. But there's another thing that can work for you, and that is your investments. We could go back and look at the assets you had on the prior page, what you own, okay, what you own, and ask yourself which of these things are going up in value. Perhaps your house, possibly you have some retirement money invested. On the other hand, some things are going down in value. Which of the things are going down in value? But what a lot of people miss is when it comes to earning things, there's 2 sources. One is your effort and one is your investments. So I like to compare when you receive a payment, like your paycheck or earnings on investment, I like to compare money to seed. Okay, I like to compare money to seed. And there's three things we can do with our seed. We can either eat it, okay, so you can bake a loaf of bread if you've got some wheat, let's say, or if you think about related to money, you can use it to pay your bills, right? Okay, so we can eat it, we can store it, okay, we can store it up. If it was grain, you might put it in a silo. If it's money, you might put it under your bed. But there's one other thing we do with seed, and that is we plant it. Okay, so we can eat it, we can store it, we can plant it. And here's the important thing to understand. There's only one way to get more seed, and that is to plant it. There's only one way to get more money out of your money, and that is to buy things that go up in value, what we would call investments. And so let me give you a little competency here as well. So if you don't know anything about how a return on your investment is calculated, there's just three factors. Here they are. There is principal, there is rate, and there is time. Principal times rate times time. If it is compounded, it means you don't just earn money on the principal, but you also earn money on the money you earned on the principal. That's what we call compound interest. So let me show you a quick example of why this is so important. My son, during the COVID-19 crisis, was able to get together a $5,000, let's call it a safety net. Okay? And I said, well, Jacob, what are you going to do with that money? And he said, well, I haven't decided yet. He had some ideas. And I said, well, what about investing? Did you know? And so here's a little investment calculator for you. Did you know if you took your $5,000, what we call our principal, and if you invested in the stock market and got 12% rate of return, okay, and you're just 23 years old right now because you just graduated from APU, okay? You're 23 years old, and that means from 23 to 65, that's 42 years until you retire. How much do you think you'll have? Well, if you guessed $750,000, you'd be right. All of a sudden, my son got very excited about investing because he saw that by planting, he could have something. Okay, so that is an important competency from going from little to much. So, what did God give you? Are you trustworthy with it? Are you making the most you can with it? Step number 3, how do we get it from here to there? Jesus says, if you can't even handle worldly wealth, who's going to give you true treasures? And this is the part where it really matters. Okay, this is the part where it really matters because, yes, we all live here on earth. We've got to pay our bills. We've got the usual pressures, okay? But ultimately, we also all know we're going to die, and there is an eternity out there. So how does it tie together? Why does Jesus say, if you can't even handle worldly wealth, who will give you true treasures, the ones that last, like, for example, friends forever? Well, let me explain. If you can't even take care of yourself, how can you ever help somebody else out? I think this is this huge driving motivation to make sure you do the best with whatever God has given you, including your money. Okay? If you want to help somebody out, you've got to figure out how to actually feed you, maybe feed your family, but rich, if your definition is more than enough, then you understand you have a more than enough to share. Okay, so how do we do this? I want to explain a penny parable. I like to call it the penny parable because there's so many things I can show you with the smallest coin available to people in the U.S. For example, do you know how much money you would have if you took one penny and doubled it every day for 1 month? Well, if it's a 31-day month, you will have $737,418.24. That is 1 billion pennies in just 1 month if you double it every day. Now, you might have recognized that's a very high rate of return. Odds are you're not going to get that, right? But still, what if you get something that is right in the sweet spot of what the financial markets have made for the last 100 years, 10%. Did you know if you make 10% on your money on 1 penny in just, let's see what I've calculated here, in just 1 year, you would pass, sorry, not 1 year, in just 194 years, sorry, that's a lot more than 1 year, in 194 years, you would pass $1 million at 10% interest. In 315 years, you would pass $100 billion. Okay, you would be the richest person on earth. Whew. You're saying, hey, Dr. Thornton, thanks for the tip. I wasn't planning on living that long. Well, so here's why I call it the penny parable. Anything invested for eternity is worth more than everything here. So 1 penny at just 315 years makes you the richest person on earth. Imagine what happens if you invest for eternity. That's what Jesus says we need to do. We need to invest for eternity. Last but not least, what happens if you have a stewardship role versus an ownership role? And this last step, principle number 4, what I call stewardship to ownership. Jesus says if you can't even manage somebody else's money, who will give you money of your own to manage? Okay? So if you can't handle somebody else's money well, who will give you money of your own to manage? Stewardship versus ownership. Stewardship is managing somebody else's money. Ownership is managing your own. Now I know that people will say, and they're right, that God owns it all. And yet he still gives us stewardship roles. He gives us ownership roles. For example, my stewardship role at Azusa Pacific University, I am managing or helping to manage the Leung endowment from LP and Bobbi Leung. Okay? That's a stewardship role, and I can't choose to do whatever I want to with that money. They wanted to see students be able to get a Christian accounting education, okay? And they also wanted accounting ethics from a Christian perspective. So with the Leung money, I want to make the biggest impact I can because I'm the steward. But then guess what happens? I get a paycheck. And when I get a paycheck, now I own that money. And so the money you own, this is really important. The money you own, there are 0 layers between you and God as far as what you are to do with it. Okay, so if God has called me, and I think he has, to feed the poor, particularly widows and orphans, and if he's called me to share the gospel, then with my own money, I need to make the biggest impact I can with that money toward those things he's called me to do. Okay? And as time goes on, as you build up more and more money, guess what? You will probably need a steward. Owners need good stewards. So how do I know if I've got a good steward? It goes right back to the overarching plan. Is that steward worthy of trust? Can they do a lot with a little? Can they get it from here to there? So that is how we get rich right, by taking what God has given us and having a high character component where we are righteous with what he's given us, and a high competency component so we handle our wealth correctly. And that is how we can gain friends forever.